Okay, afternoon, everyone. Again, Jane Lazorchak. I lead the Climate Action Office in the Agency of Natural Resources, and I'm working collaboratively with Andrea Wright, who's the Environmental Policy Manager for the Agency of Transportation, and other staff, state staff today to join you and welcome you to talking with us over your lunchtime hour about a Cap and Invest study that the state is endeavoring to do this fall and winter. We're going to get started now. It's just after 12 to be mindful of everybody's time. And I'm going to turn it over to Tony, who is a consultant working with us to support the engagement this afternoon. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Jane. Welcome, everyone. Tony Marie Pignatelli, and I'll serve as the facilitator for today's meeting. I'm with a FHI Studio, which is part of the consulting team that's working with the state on this effort. I'm going to provide an overview of the format for our meeting this afternoon. So today, all participants will be placed on mute and will have their video cameras turned off. The meeting is being recorded. So if you do not wish to be part of a recorded meeting, understood, please go ahead and disconnect. Please disconnect if you do not want to be part of a recorded meeting. I'm going to suggest a few tips on how to participate in the virtual meeting. I know many of you are familiar with Zoom, but I'll review these tips to help you navigate today. One, to preserve bandwidth and have a smoother virtual meeting experience, you may want to shut off your other programs, close the other programs that may be running on your computer. If you have any issues with Zoom during the meeting, we have technical support available to assist you. You can reach this person, Sarah Grossman, by using the Zoom chat feature or sending a message to technical host. You can also email Sarah at sgrossman@fhistudio.com. SGROSSMAN at fhistudio.com. And again, that's if you need any assistance with Zoom. And we're gonna, her email, Sarah's email is included on the screen. If you're disconnected at any point in the meeting or having bandwidth issues with your internet, there is the option for you to phone into the meeting. You can use the toll-free number on your screen to access the meeting if you're disconnected, or if joining by phone is just a better option for you. So the number to phone is 305-224-1968. Again, 305-224-1968. If you telephone in, you'll need to enter the number on your screen to access the meeting, and that's the meeting ID. The number is 858-8820-7446, and the passcode is 772409. No, that's a lot. It's all on the screen. And again, that's if you are disconnected or you prefer using your phone. Lastly, Zoom is generating closed captions for this meeting, and they should be showing up at the bottom of your screen. If you're seeing them and you don't want them on and you want to turn them off, or if you're seeing them and you want to turn them on, you can do so by clicking the button in your Zoom toolbar that says CC. And if you don't see the CC button, you can click more of the three dots, and then you can select captions. So our goal today is to get feedback for everyone. We really appreciate your time, and we're eager to hear from you. Throughout the presentation, please use the chat feature to send any questions or comments on the presentation content to the technical host. Again, technical host, you can send questions or comments. At the close of the presentation on Cap and Invest, we'll open up the question and answer session when members of the study team will respond to your questions and comments. So please send any questions to the technical host, and the project team, the study team will respond to them during the question and answer session towards the end of today's meeting. We want to be respectful of everybody's time and finish by 1 o'clock. If time doesn't allow for us to respond to all of your questions and comments during the meeting, a summary of the comments, including those that we don't get to during today's meeting, will be posted on the project website. And we'll drop the project website into the chat. It's climatechange.vermont.gov/cap-and-invest-study. And again, that link is included in the chat if you want to navigate there now. We'll be using polling questions throughout the presentation. Responses are anonymous. Responses are completely anonymous. When we arrive at the first polling question, we'll share instructions with you on how to participate. And again, thank you. And please use the chat and respond to the technical host with any questions or any technical issues. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrea.
Thank you, Tony. To review the agenda today, the purpose of our meeting is to first provide some background as to what has led the state to exploring a Cap and Invest program. We want to explain what a Cap and Invest program is and how it works, including how such a program might help the state meet its climate pollution reduction requirements, as well as discuss the potential benefits and impacts of such a program to Vermonters. And then we'll take some time towards the end to introduce the specific study that the state is involved in. I do want to preface that this presentation, the state of Vermont is in the process of conducting a study to evaluate the options for joining a Cap and Invest program and the potential benefits and costs. The state is not at this time actually implementing a Cap and Invest program. And again, we will spend a few minutes discussing the study with you before opening up the question and answer towards the end. Just want to take a few minutes to introduce the team. Again, my name is Andrea Wright. I'm the Environmental Policy Manager at VTrans, or AOT. You've already met Jane with ANR Climate Action Office and Tony Marie, who's our today's meeting facilitator. I'm just going to take a moment to introduce additional members. We have a real deep bench of expertise on the consultant team. We have Chris Porter from Cambridge Systematics serving as the project manager for the work. We have Mark Halfstead and Molly Robinson with Resources for the Future, serving as program experts and leading the technical analysis for the study. And then we also have a few members from the state project team that might pop in later to help answer any questions that any of you may have. We have Brian Woods, Environmental Analyst, and Sophie Veltrop, Engagement and Communications Coordinator, both with the ANR Climate Action Office. And we also have Patrick Murphy, Sustainability and Innovations Project Manager with the Environmental Policy and Sustainability team at AOT.
Thanks, Andrea. So at this point, we are going to invite you all to participate in the first polling question. And to do so, you can click the link in the chat, or you can visit www.menti.com. Again, www.menti.com. When you arrive at the page, you can type in the code 18762168. I'm going to give everyone a moment to click on the link, visit the website. You can also use the QR code. There will be multiple polling questions throughout the meeting, so please don't close out of the Menti page once you've arrived. We're going to give people a moment to log in. And then we can pull up the question. What county do you live in? And you should be seeing a bar where you can enter responses and they'll populate live on the screen. So we can see where you all are joining us from today. Okay. Folks joining us from Grand Isle, Orange County, Chittenden, Washington, Franklin, Windsor. All right. Let's see. Well, thank you very much for participating. And now we will move on to our second polling question. How much knowledge do you have of Cap and Invest, or Cap and Trade, as it is sometimes called? All right, we're seeing the results come in, live tallying. So we have the majority feel they have a little knowledge on the topic. Some have none, and a number of you have a lot. Okay, that's fantastic. All right, thanks for giving us that baseline understanding of who we're talking to today. All right, and with that, I am going to turn it back over to Jane.
Everyone, happy to have you here again, and we thought we would just take a couple slides to sort of walk through what the state has done to date to lead us to the point of studying a Cap and Invest as a policy option for the state of Vermont in meeting our climate goals. So first and foremost, I think many of you may be aware of this, but Vermont enacted the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2020. That is a comprehensive climate law that looks at how we address climate action across various sectors and areas, including resilience and adaptation. But first and foremost, and often held up as sort of the main and front and center requirements of that law, is it took goals that had been on the books for a long time in Vermont and made those statutory requirements about how we cut our climate pollution. It speaks to an immediate target that's coming up, actually the first one at the end of this year, January 1st of 2025, where we need to cut our climate pollution 26% below 2005 levels. And then a more challenging target, one also on the horizon, but a little further out, is 40% below 2030, 40% below 1990 levels for 2030. So what you'll notice is for both 2025 and 2030, the baseline year for which we need to cut below is different. 2005 was actually a year where we had a lot of emissions, so 26% below, an easier target to meet, and 40% below 1990 levels is roughly cutting our emissions in half. And that's in line with global commitments in the Paris Climate Agreement and Vermont playing our role. It also speaks to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, and the work that we do today sets us up for success further out. In 2021, Vermont adopted its initial climate action plan. That was a requirement of the Global Warming Solutions Act. The GWSA set up a climate council, an independent body made up of state officials, as well as legislative appointments who have a stake in climate change. So people who represent environmental organizations, farm and forest, utilities, combined with secretaries and commissioners of agencies who play a significant role in climate action. That climate council worked in a very short order to adopt the initial plan, and that set forth a broad plan around climate action, but also specific strategies to reduce emissions as required by the law. The Climate Action Plan has since been updated and modified. The initial plan in 2021 called for the state to pursue and consider a cap and invest program specific to transportation fuels. And there's been other actions since then articulating further study in that space, in the climate space. We first sort of took a step back. Vermont had a unique opportunity through the development of the carbon reduction strategy, which was required of VTrans, the Agency of Transportation, as part of new federal funding coming in, to look first and foremost at how the Agency of Transportation could reduce emissions through the programming they have control over. And then through that acknowledgement that we were going to have to look elsewhere outside of programs and policies that we currently have on the book to think about how to further invest in climate action. That carbon reduction strategy essentially said more action is needed in the transportation space to meet our emissions reductions. In response to that, the state is exploring a cap and invest as a potential policy to understand both the benefits for emissions reductions and the benefits more broadly to the state in pursuing a program like that, as well as the impacts of cost changes and transition away from fossil fuels. So this study and this policy exploration is all in service to an update to the Climate Action Plan, which is due July 1st of 2025. And this study will certainly inform the actions laid out in that plan. So just really quickly, what do those emissions targets look like? This graphic that is developed by the Energy Action Network with state data. So our office within the Agency of Natural Resources since 2007 has been producing an annual emissions inventory specific to Vermont. That data lags a number of years. So we just published a few months ago the 2021 inventory. While we do our best to use local data as much as possible in that inventory, some of the modules that inform the sectors on the screen come to us from national data sets. And unfortunately, a few of them lag a few years, and it holds us back from being more in line with the calendar year. So we just produced 2021. We're in the process of developing 2022 now as we look to actually move into calendar year 2025. So the left side of this chart on the screen that is not grayed out or doesn't have a shadow over it is real emissions data that the state has produced through our greenhouse gas inventory. That again, through 2021, shows that we currently produce 8.28 million metric tons of emissions annually. The largest sectors from which those emissions come from are transportation in green, and buildings and thermal, how we heat our homes, our commercial buildings, industry in orange. And then our third largest sector is actually agriculture in Vermont. And that's shown in yellow. And the blue, which you can see, which is relatively small, is more typically aligned in states as their third largest sector, which is where they get their electricity from. But Vermont has done a very good job in cleaning up our electricity where we purchase it from, and continue to do so through policies that were passed like last year with 100% renewable energy standard. So what you see is where we're going. We're trending downward, certainly in our emissions, and we are, relatively close to meeting our 2025 target. We will know that when we produce the inventory for that year in 2027. So we still have a few years, even though that inventory, that calendar year wraps up at the end of this year. But what is clear is that more policy intervention, more action from the state and other players is needed to ensure that we are able to meet our 2030 emissions reduction requirements, which is out at cutting roughly in half from our 1990 levels, 40% below, and needs to get to 5.14. So you can really see that steep trajectory beyond 2025, and an acknowledgement from us that other modeling we have does not show us on track or getting close to meeting that, and hence where we are today in thinking about what are some other policy options or regulatory structures that can help support Vermont in meeting those requirements, as well as invest in further climate action. So with that, I want to turn it over to Mark with RFF to really speak to how a cap and invest works and ground us in the policy and science in order to think about the impacts and benefits of that kind of a policy on Vermont.
Thank you, Jane. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Hasted. I'm a climate economist at Resources of the Future. For those of you who don't know what Resources of the Future is, we are an independent nonprofit research institution based in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to improve environmental, energy, and natural resource decisions through impartial economic research and policy engagement. Importantly, RFF does not take institutional positions on legislative, regulatory, judicial, or other public policy matters. We see our approach as informing policymakers and also educating the public through things like this today. So the purpose today is to kind of explain how a cap and invest program works and how such a program might help Vermont meet its emissions requirements. Again, the caveat I need to mention is that the state is evaluating creating such a program, but no decisions have been made moving forward with it yet. So a traditional approach to regulating pollution sets a limit on emissions or emissions intensity from different sources of emissions. So you can think of emissions per mile from a car or emissions per megawatt hour from a power plant. And the limits generally apply to every emitter within the source category. Now, this approach could be effective, but it also might be relatively costly. First, it would require regulators to know exactly how much it costs to reduce emissions in different sectors, or even within sectors, different types of sources within a sector. And that information can be very hard to find. And so some regulations might require relatively expensive reductions while leaving some cost-effective reductions on the table. So a cap and invest program is an approach to reduce emissions that can be complementary to other types of regulations. And in essence, the state sets a cap on carbon emissions, and that cap declines over time. Importantly, the cap can reflect the state's requirements for reducing emissions under the GWSA. So how the cap works is that there's the cap, and then allowances are distributed. You know, a right to emit a carbon is allocated across different entities, companies that are required to hold allowances. You know, the permission to emit 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide. These emissions can be sold at auction, which can raise proceeds, which then can be used to invest in further types of emissions reductions, such as investing in clean energy or energy efficiency, or it could also be invested in things like climate resilience. And we'll get back to some of the ways that the money can be invested later. Now, importantly, under a cap and trade program, the state can achieve cost-effective emissions reductions without the regulators knowing anything about the cost of emissions reductions across the different firms or sectors. Why is this? If the market allowance price is $20 per ton of CO2, any firm or sector that can reduce its emissions below $20 has an incentive to do that, because they, instead of having to hold the allowance, they can save money by reducing their emissions. Other firms that find it more expensive to reduce emissions will simply buy the allowance and hold the allowance. So we can move to the next slide, please. So a cap and invest program starts with an inventory of sources, which Vermont already does, as Jane already mentioned. And then we can look at what are the current emissions. So Jane definitely mentioned that there are some lags in being able to monitor emissions. So not all emissions are easy to measure and monitor kind of in real time. So that means that maybe not all of emissions will be covered. And then once we decide, once we know what the current emissions are and how we measure those emissions in real time, we can start with our emissions budget and start declining that over time. So importantly, Vermont as a state can choose which sources to cover. So it could cover fossil fuels for transportation only, or it could also include fossil fuels used for buildings, so thermal heating. And it could also possibly cover large industrial sources. And so one of the things we're looking at this study is the advantages and disadvantages of covering different sectors. And I should mention that the power sector and industry sector, those are supposed to be factories with emissions coming out of them. I do know that sometimes people think they look like trees. So let's move to the next slide. So who is actually regulated? Who's required to hold an allowance for a right to emit pollution in the marketplace? When there are a lot of numerous polluters where the combustion actually happens, such as in the transportation sector, it's not going to be efficient to require individuals to hold allowances for the emissions that come out of their tailpipe. Rather, it's more practical to regulate the upstream fuel suppliers, because we know how much emissions come from combusting those fuels when they're sold to their consumers. So generally, we think that fuel distributors and suppliers would be responsible for compliance in addition to large industrial sources rather than individuals or small businesses. So I already kind of mentioned this a little bit, but how does the market work? So we have an allowance market. Company A maybe emits more pollution than company B. But maybe company B starts by buying 5 allowances, and then it realizes that it could, if it made an investment in clean energy, it might be only needed 2 allowances. So it could sell its excess allowances back into the market. And so this is also going to allow, if it's more expensive to reduce emissions at company A or company B, we're going to get more emissions reductions at company B than company A. And so it doesn't force either company to make the same investments. It incentivizes the companies to make the cost-effective investments that it can. So moving on to the next slide. So now let's talk about how a Cap and Invest program could help Vermont meet its climate goals. So first of all, Cap and Invest is not new, and Cap and Invest is not new to Vermont. Vermont has been participating in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which sets a cap on emissions from electricity generation from power plants within the New England and Mid-Atlantic regions. The program has been in place since 2009, and has certainly helped reduce emissions and generate revenue for the participating states, including Vermont. And I should note that Pennsylvania is technically a participating state, but its participation is pending a state Supreme Court ruling. So over time, in RGGI, emissions from the power sector have gone down while the economy has grown. So the red line depicts a declining trajectory of overall RGGI electricity emissions from 2005 to 2021, while the blue line shows the steady upward trend in GDP across the same region during the same time frame. And so these RGGI investments have also helped save participants money on their energy bills, create jobs, and reduce carbon emissions, even while the regional economy has been growing. So moving to the next slide, RGGI has generated proceeds for investments in energy efficiency and clean energy. So this graph is showing where the investments from 2022 allowance proceeds have gone to across the entire RGGI program, across all the RGGI states. And so a lot of the money has gone to residential efficiency and clean energy investments. Some has gone to business efficiency and clean energy. And in Vermont, most of the money has gone through Vermont Efficiency, or Efficiency Vermont, excuse me, which includes home energy loans and incentives, small business energy efficiency incentives, and low-income energy services. So Vermont has already participated in the RGGI program, but we also have other Cap and Invest programs going on throughout North America. So California started this program in 2013, and Quebec joined with them in 2014. Washington State started its own program in 2023 and is currently in negotiations to join the Western Climate Initiative. And New York State is developing an economy-wide Cap and Invest program called NYCI, NYCI, New York Cap and Invest. And that program is slated to start in 2026. And so Vermont does not necessarily need to go it alone to do a Cap and Invest program on transportation emissions, or more broadly, building emissions or industrial sources. So New York could partner with, say, its neighbor Quebec or its neighbor New York. And one of the things we're doing in this study is trying to look at the impacts on Vermont that would occur if Vermont decided to join the New York program or the California-Quebec program. So what are some of those potential benefits and impacts going to be? Moving to the next slide. So just kind of qualitatively, how would we think a Cap and Invest program affects Vermonters? So there's a lot of benefits. So the benefits are it generates proceeds through these auctions, and those proceeds can be invested into climate action, such as energy efficiency programs, EV incentives, and climate resilience. Through those investments, we expect to have more jobs in the climate workforce. Further, when we reduce fossil fuel combustion, we reduce not only carbon dioxide emissions, but we also reduce local air pollutants, such as sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, or particulate matter pollution. And reducing those emissions can significantly improve the health and environment of Vermont, making it a better place to live and play. A Cap and Invest program also formalizes a timeline for emissions reductions for business investment decision-making. Currently, businesses expect they need to reduce their emissions going forward in the future, but there's a lot of uncertainty as to what type of incentives they'll be facing over time and how they should reduce their emissions over time. And so by setting a declining cap, it give decision makers certainty on the timeline for when they need to make their emissions reductions. Now, cap and invest program might not be all benefits, and so some of the other impacts could be the program increases the relative price of conventional fossil fuels, and it can also create potential border effects with non-participating neighbors. An example of a border effect with a non-participating neighbor could be businesses choosing to move to the neighbor that doesn't have a similar climate policy, or it could be simply like drivers going across state borders to buy gasoline that is not affected by the cap and invest program. So when a cap and invest program is designed, the program can be designed to make sure that the program is affordable for Vermonters. First, the program can set an upper limit on the emissions price, which is a cap such that the allowance price is not allowed to go over a certain amount. And so that gives some certainty to businesses and individuals on what the overall price impact could be of a cap and invest program. The state can also target proceeds to lower income households. These could be through investments in reducing emissions from low-income households. So you could think of income-qualified heat pump rebates, weatherization programs, or electric vehicle incentives. Or we could also think about directly allocating some of the proceeds to lower-income households through rebates. So the remaining proceeds can be invested to make it easier overall for the state to switch to clean energy. In that, importantly, the clean energy is not affected by the pollution price that the cap and invest program puts forward. Further, if we think that there are some industries that are at risk to leave the state, the program could allocate emissions for free to some of those industries just to make sure that their business and their production remains in state. So coming up on time here, so I'm going to wrap up, is I've already mentioned a lot of how the proceeds could be reinvested into clean energy and efficiency programs. These could be home weatherization, electric vehicle incentives and charging, solar energy, investments in transportation alternatives to reduce vehicle miles traveled. All of these programs are going to directly benefit Vermont's households and businesses. And again, we can also direct those funds to those who need the assistance the most, such as lower income households and small businesses. I should note that the state needs legislative authorization to both take in and spend the money. So the way that the proceeds will be reinvested will ultimately be determined by the legislature. And my final slide, in summary, Vermont is considering a cap and invest program for a number of reasons. I think the first reason is that Vermont has requirements for reducing climate pollution in the state, and this program provides more certainty for how to achieve those reductions. It raises proceeds that can be reinvested in making Vermont's homes, cars, trucks, businesses, and industries more energy efficient and convert them to cleaner forms of energy. And again, reiterating the point that the way that those proceeds are spent can be used to improve equity by targeting the incentives to lower income households. The rising price for conventional polluting energy helps tilt the playing field towards renewables, clean energy, and efficiency. And finally, the cap and invest program does not have to be a standalone program for reducing emissions within the state. It can complement other policies that Vermont already has in place or policies that Vermont is considering putting in place. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you for your time.
Mark, thank you very much. We have arrived at our third polling question of the day. Now that you've heard a bit about cap and invest, and before we turn it over to Jane to speak about the climate study that is currently underway that the state is undertaking, we have a question for you. What additional information or resources, if any, would help to increase your knowledge of Cap and Invest programs? Again, we're asking what additional information or resources would help to increase your knowledge of Cap and Invest programs. And if you've closed out a Mentimeter, you can access it again by clicking the link in the chat, or you can visit www.menti.com and then type in the code 1876-2168. All right. Okay, we have a couple of responses coming in. This is great. People would like to know where Cap and Invest is working, where do renewable liquids fuels fit, get a sense of the potential revenue generated. Okay, these are all incredibly helpful responses as we move through this study. Great that we can consider. Articles written in local media. I'd like to know about the cost of allowances in states that have already adopted. All right, this is wonderful. So these are information and resources. Some of these are questions, and we are going to open it up to Q&A in a moment. So if you want to drop some of these in the chat, direct them to the technical host. We'll do our best to answer them during today's meeting, and if not, we'll be responding to questions and posting them on the website. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jane, who will discuss the study that's underway.
Sorry, everyone. I started talking without actually having my video on and or off. So thank you so much to Tony and Mark. Just wanted to ground us in the timing of the study and what we're actually trying to develop through doing this work. So just a reminder, as I mentioned at the beginning, this study was recommended by the Climate Council and through the Climate Action Plan, but just it went a step further last year with the legislature actually requiring the state to do this study through Act 148 of the T-bill. And it specifically requires the state and us as the state project team to coordinate with the Vermont Climate Council and to develop a written analysis of many of the things that Mark just alluded to as benefits and impacts of a program like this. So we're looking specifically at the pros, cons, costs, and benefits of Vermont participating potentially in the New York Cap and Invest program and or the Western Climate Initiative. But we're also looking beyond Cap and Invest as a single strategy and thinking about complementary strategies such as Clean Transportation Fuel Standard, which deals with residual fuels left in the marketplace and working to clean them up. So there'll also be a qualitative assessment of how much further Vermont can go in meeting its emissions reductions goals in adopting complementary policies to a Cap and Invest. Next slide. So specifically, we'll have detailed information that corresponds to many of the questions that I saw come up as people said, what are the things you want to know in greater detail? Our study will actually estimate the amount of emissions reductions that could be generated over a time period in joining either one of those two programs that we mentioned. It'll look at the revenue from different prices in the program that could be generated for reinvestment and look at what further work, what further emissions reductions could we get through that reinvestment of those dollars, as well as the benefits of reinvestment in other climate actions, such as resilience and adaptation, understanding that when Vermont has a moral and statutory obligation to cut our emissions, but we also are feeling the impacts and effects of climate change now. So how do we complement emissions reductions with investments now to enhance the communities in which we live in? And also thinking about the resources and the cost of either one of those two programs to administer. These are not simple programs. There are a lot of regulatory components. And what is that administrative burden and state staff that are needed to actually successfully roll out the program? And just to be clear, the legislature required on us that a recommendation be delivered to the legislature coming from the Treasurer's Office by February of this year about how what a program could look like for Vermont, which one, and what how Vermont could or couldn't move forward with standing up one of these programs. So we're really grateful to collaborate with the Treasurer's Office on this, understanding that they really have that economic expertise to really think about how we can maximize a program like this. I'm going to turn it over to Andrea to talk a little bit more about the next steps.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, we wanted to take a minute to let you know about other engagement efforts that we have related to the study. So in addition to this public meeting, we're holding focus groups with representatives of potentially affected entities. That'll happen in late October, and that will serve as a first round of engagement. And then we'll hold a second set of meetings, including another public meeting or a couple of public meetings like we are today, just after the new year, when we have developed draft program recommendations. We also have developed a study webpage, and that's hosted at the Climate Action Office website. And we'll post, notifications about the meetings and some of the materials that we're reviewing and plans and those types of things. So definitely a place for you to check out and get more information on. So just looking at our timeline, we contracted the work in July. We aim to have preliminary findings of the analysis by mid to late November. We are showing a touch point here with the legislature in mid-November because we are required to provide a written report to them, the status of the work to several different legislative committees. We'll have a draft report by the end of the year. And as I just mentioned in the previous slide, we'll present the summary of the findings of our analysis and a draft recommendation to stakeholders and the public in just after the new year in early 2025. And then the study will conclude, Jane just mentioned, with first ANR and AOT providing a final report for the analysis to the legislative committees, and then the state treasurer's office providing a written recommendation regarding any viable approaches for a cap and invest program for Vermont. And that's going to the General Assembly, again, like Jane said, in mid-February. So that is what we wanted to cover. I believe now we're going to open it up. Tony's going to facilitate some question and answer.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Jane. Really appreciate it. The study team is now going to respond to questions and comments from participants. We've had a number of questions come in. The polling questions, we'd like to respond to those as well. But if you have yet to submit a question and would like to do so, now is definitely your opportunity. So send your questions, comments to the technical host in the chat panel. Again, we want to be respectful of everyone's time. We are going to close the meeting at 1 o'clock today. For those questions that we are unable to answer, we'll be posting responses to the website, climatechange.vermont.gov/cap-and-invest study, and we'll drop that in the chat as well. Okay, so our first question today is, will you break down transportation and into what type? Will you break down transportation into what types? Buses, trucking, personal, and where there may be heavy use areas. And this is in reference to the historical GHG emissions and future requirements on slide 11. So if we could possibly navigate back to that slide, and I'm going to hand this question over to Jane to get us started. And if others, subject matter experts, want to chime in, please do so.
Sure. I don't think we need the slide. You're happy to, but what this slide, what the sectors cover is done through different means of where we acquire our data. So the transportation sector, we get our data directly from DMV. So those fuels that are sold with respect to use in transportation sector, so diesel and unleaded gasoline that's used across the board in transportation, have a tax excised on them, and that data is very explicit to transportation sector fossil fuel production and use, and the RCI, which is the orange sector, the residential, commercial, industrial sector, is really around, we are able to tease out those fossil fuels through other tax revenues receipts that are used in houses and home heating and appliances and other things in our homes. And so hopefully I'm answering that question sort of correctly, but the data that we actually use for the greenhouse gas inventory is able to account for how those fossil fuels are used and whether they're used in transportation versus our homes. And so that data is reflected right now in the greenhouse gas inventory.
Thank you, Jane. I appreciate that. Our second question, this is directed towards Mark. So where do renewable liquids fit?
So renewable liquid fuels generally could fit in if the price of fossil fuel goes up, that might create an incentive to increase the blend of renewable fuels or to switch to fully renewable fuels. I think that the better way to address renewable liquid fuels is through a low carbon fuel standard. And that is something we didn't talk about very much today, but something that's going to be part of our study going forward.
Thank you, Mark. Mark, you touched on this in the presentation a bit. Maybe you could elaborate. Where is Cap and Invest for transportation working? I think you actually touched on electricity, but for transportation, where is it working?
The California Cap and Invest program, the Western Climate Initiative with Quebec, is a economy-wide cap and trade program. So it includes transportation fuels. So does Washington State's program. So both of those include transportation fuels.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. All right, our next question. Are there similar case studies that showed the price impacts to consumers? Again, are there similar case studies that showed price impacts to consumers?
So, I mean, the exact price impact to consumers is going to depend on a lot of factors. It's going to depend on what the allowance price ends up being in the market, which is uncertain by kind of definition. So, California's allowance price has fluctuated a lot over the last few years. Upwards of $40, downwards of $20, kind of everywhere in between. So by design, the allowance price is relatively uncertain. So it's hard for us to predict exactly what the price would be if Vermont joined a specific program, whether or not that's the Western Climate Initiative or the yet to be stood up New York program, which has even more uncertainty about what the allowance price is going to be, because there's still a lot of uncertainty about what the design of that program will actually look like. I and some colleagues at RFF did do a study for the state of Vermont on carbon taxes back in 2019 for the Joint Fiscal Office. Some of those findings will be applicable to the Cap and Invest program, but not all of them.
Thank you, Mark. All right, would a Cap and Invest have to be? Oh, excuse me, I'm jumping around here. Let me prioritize these in the order that they're coming in. You're submitting a lot of great questions. I would like to understand the trickle-down financial impact for Vermonters. Would somebody be able to speak to that topic?
I'll just jump in and say that we will be, as part of this study, we will be conducting a comprehensive assessment of household level benefits and costs incurred by the program, and that will include both costs related to fuel use, any benefits related to switching to cleaner fuels, and to any incentives that may be delivered to Vermont's households. And we will be looking at how those vary by income group. So that will be something that will be studied in depth.
Thank you, Chris. Great. So there's a question here. How do we access resources to make home improvements and vehicle choices? And I'm going to direct that to Jane, with others, chiming in as appropriate.
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways, and that's actually some of the work of the Climate Council and the Climate Action Plan this time, is to really think about how to streamline those processes to make them most readily available to folks who have would benefit the most from them and have the least amount of time to really do the legwork to take advantage of them. So partnerships with CAP agencies and elsewhere in the state. That said, Efficiency Vermont is a really good place to start. We can put the website in the chat. They administer and cover most of the state with respect to home weatherization efficiency, as well as fuel switching incentives. Drive Electric is housed within there, so state vehicle incentives and others. They are a really robust place to start, and I would recommend people go there first.
Thank you, Jane. A question for Mark. Let's see. Who is actually buying the credits? Who's actually buying the credits in these instances?
So generally it's gonna be fuel suppliers. So wholesale fuel suppliers are actually the people who actually pay gasoline taxes today. So you do not actually pay a gasoline tax at the pump, but it's passed through to you from the fuel suppliers to the retail dealers, retail gasoline suppliers. And so it worked very similarly. So it would be the fuel suppliers and distributors who would be required to purchase allowances for the carbon contents of the fuels they sold. We know how much carbon dioxide comes out of a gallon of gasoline.
Thank you, Mark. So a question about this study for Jane. What potential timelines are being studied or considered for the start of the program?
Yeah, so well, we're looking at how different costs of allowances would impact and benefit emissions reductions on different trajectories. So we're looking at what different costs would get us with respect to how we meet or can't meet our 2030 emissions reductions requirements, and if not by 2030 at a certain price, like when do we actually catch up with those emissions reductions? So really, the driver is the allowance price that we're modeling. And Mark can correct me if there's something different more about the timelines, but we're really looking at the allowance price and then thinking about what the outcomes are based on that allowance price with respect to emissions reductions, as well as financial revenue that the state would receive and be able to invest.
Thanks, Jane. We have a question here about the interaction between Cap and Invest and the state's participation in RGGI. So what potential options are being studied in terms of the interaction between a Vermont Cap and Invest and state's participation in RGGI? I'm gonna give that one to Mark. If you don't mind taking that one, Mark, or Jane, please.
Well, I mean, I can just say that similar to the modeling that's been done for New York's Cap and Invest, they're looking at an economy-wide Cap and Invest program in New York minus the electricity sector because they are in RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative Mark spoke to. So Vermont too is not considering including electricity in this program through the study we're now conducting. And so we actually haven't really talked about the interplay, except for the benefit that our state has very clean electricity that's getting only cleaner, so that when you're thinking about transition and decarbonization in the sectors that we're talking about regulating, there's the ability to electrify and move those sources over to cleaner electricity that has benefited through programs like RGGI and a performance standard in Vermont.
Thanks, Jane. And then we have, would a Cap and Invest have to be implemented by legislative statute?
Yeah, so the Agency of Natural Resources has statutory authority to set up through the Clean Air Act cap and trade program. So the distinction there is that we can set a cap and regulate emissions as an agency. We do not have the power to charge for those allowances. So any program that Vermont would look to stand up would have to be understanding and expecting that we would want to charge for the allowances at some rate to realize the benefit and the increased benefit of having revenue to invest and support climate action. It would have to be a collaborative effort to both adopt the model rule that sets the cap and allowances, but work with the legislature to have the power and authority to actually collect revenue and spend that money on climate and action.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, and a question about study process. So is the obligated industries focus group has the obligated industries focus group invitation come?
We have not sent out any invitations yet, is my understanding, but Sophie or Tony can mention that for the stakeholder meetings or interested party meetings. And that is on our imminent to-do list to ensure that people have sufficient notice to hopefully participate and engage with us in a meaningful way at the end of the month.
Thank you, Jane. Scrolling through, see if there's any remaining questions that we could take the next minute or two to answer.
I did see one question that I might take the liberty, because I'm sure people are interested in, is for many people on this call, people have been watching the state or thinking about these kinds of policies for a while, and there was a question around the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which, as a reminder, was a Northeast state in Washington, D.C., and some others who worked for a decade on thinking about a cap and invest program to cover the transportation sector specifically. That Vermont was considering joining. We were a member in the study and in the program, in the process itself, the collaborative, I should say, but we had not acted to join as the program. Washington, D.C., Connecticut, and Massachusetts had taken the next step and said they were standing up the program. And this was all happening while Vermont was moving forward its initial climate action plan that was looking to obligate and push Vermont to join that program. And right at the 11th or 12th hour, whatever the expression is, before we signed our climate action plan, Connecticut and Massachusetts pulled out and said they would no longer be advancing a cap and invest program. And so hence why our initial climate action plan says to monitor TCIP and join or consider joining as the program becomes viable again, because without a big state or big states to make it economically viable and effective, Vermont could not do it alone. And that's one of the rationales behind what the carbon reduction strategy said, and now our study is doing, is recognizing that these policies do have cost benefits really for the state, but also implications, and that those costs can be moderated by joining with other states and thinking about a regional market. And the carbon reduction strategy, as well as the legislature, obligated us to look collaboratively with other states and other programs like NICI and WCI for a reason, because we expect and understand cost savings through doing that kind of approach. So TCIP is not, no states have been talking about revitalizing that for a while. And that is not, that was something that fell apart right at the 11th hour of the climate action plan.
I wanted to just take prerogative to answer one of the questions I see on the list. And that's the question about the use of offsets. So we are not scoped to look at the question of offsets in our study to look at the implications of the use of offsets. I should notice that different programs have different rules. So New York's program is currently not considering the use of offsets, although that can change because they still haven't finalized any of their details. The state of California allows covered entities to submit like somewhere between 4 and 8% of their allowances or offsets in lieu of allowances. That is a cap that changes over time. So some years it's 4%, some years it's 8%, some years it's 6%. They also have strict rules that at least half the offsets have to deliver environmental benefits to the state of California. So that means that so sometimes some of these allowances come from methane reductions at dairy farms in Indiana. But there's a limit to how much you can do that. So it has to be things that would help, like say, improve rivers within California. So a forest project in Northern California that's going to improve a river ecosystem would qualify as providing a direct benefit to the state of California. And that's going to be ultimately up to the state of Vermont to decide how they want to deal with those going forward. But we're not going to actually look at the implications of that in our study.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, and there are no California offset projects in Vermont. We're one of the few states that don't actually have any, but there are many projects in Massachusetts and Maine that are forest conservation projects. And I think those are probably older at this point and wouldn't be allowed anymore because of that component that Mark just spoke to around benefit. But there are forest conservation projects in the Northeast that benefited from California's offset program.
Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you very much, Mark. In the interest of time, we are going to move along and just share how you can stay involved in this project, in this study. You can visit the study website at climatechange.vermont.gov/cap-and-invest study. So again, we'll drop that in the chat, and we will be posting responses to the questions there. We had a number of good questions, didn't have an opportunity to respond to all of them. If you go to the website, you can follow the project and you can receive responses to the questions that were submitted. And you can also share your thoughts with the study team. Email anr.cao@vermont.gov. You can also phone 802-404-2729. And with that, Jane, any closing words? Andrea?
I just really appreciate people taking the time to join us this afternoon and hope that you will engage in the process over the next few months to learn more and have your voice heard. So thank you so much.